This week, Joe Biden signed Build Back Better 2.0 into law, under a pseudonym to simply fool everyday Americans. What's inside of this, quote, Inflation Reduction Act? And why is no one talking about it? This is Big Red, and you're listening to the Big Red for America show. The oddly named, quote, Inflation Reduction Act passed this week and was signed into law by President Biden, which gave him a much-needed political victory. It passed the Senate barely, with 51 senators voting for it, which was all the Democrats and Vice President Kamala Harris, who cast a tie-breaking vote, over the 50 Republicans, who all voted against it. Even maverick Democratic senators like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema were convinced to fall in line and vote for this Build Back Better 2.0. Chuck Schumer said he struck a deal with Joe Manchin, who was a reliable holdout. And according to some, they imply that Joe Manchin got on board because he simply named the bill the Inflation Reduction Act. CNN Politics says, quote, the Inflation Reduction Act, named to lure Manchin, though it will have negligible impact on inflation this year, unquote. So here we have CNN kind of admitting that this bill was just named the Inflation Reduction Act to entice Manchin to get on board and vote for it. So I think this is extremely interesting that the Democrats just named this bill the Inflation Reduction Act, even though it has nothing to do with inflation, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So they named it the Inflation Reduction Act just to gain political support and get it to pass. That's extremely interesting. And once again, this is CNN saying this. This isn't some right-wing news source. CNN Politics admits that this bill will do nothing to reduce inflation this year. But unfortunately, it gets worse and worse for this bill. UPenn, which is also not very conservative-friendly, mentions that any effect this bill has on inflation will be negligible. The Democrats claim that the reduction in the federal deficit will reduce inflation, but UPenn says payments to liquidity-constrained households, essentially poor households, exceed total deficit reduction. So already we have essentially no deficit reduction, and statistically, UPenn continues, even ignoring its composition, the CBO's, Congressional Budget Office's, estimated $21 billion in total deficit reduction amounts to less than, buckle yourselves in, 0.018%, or 2/100ths of 1%, of cumulative projected GDP over the same years. So for those of you following at home, this bill will reduce inflation by 0.018%, assuming that the budget deficit actually comes through, which UPenn also says it won't. UPenn finishes it off with saying, quote, the impact on inflation is statistically indistinguishable from zero. So the bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, will have zero impact on inflation this year and also the next 5 years. So given that we're still seeing inflation staying at a 4-decade high, which was around 8.5 last month in the month of July, it's good to see that the Democrats are really prioritizing inflation. Even with the falling gas prices, core inflation still rose from June till July. And I mean, this just proves that Biden and his administration and Democrats are not serious about reducing inflation, but rather covering up their big government spending plans in a nice outer wrapping of the, quote, Inflation Reduction Act. So what did we actually get in the bill named the Inflation Reduction Act? Because we know it's not about inflation. We know that this bill will not reduce inflation over a 5-year period at all. So we could reasonably see inflation continuing to grow under the Biden administration, even though they tout this as some sort of victory. But we'll get into whatever victory they claim they're winning a little bit later. So what actually did we get? We didn't get lower inflation, but we did get higher taxes. Yay! So remember when Joe Biden promised not to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000? Me too. That was a core tenet of his campaign. That was one of his big campaign promises. Well, he broke it. In fact, all Democrats voted to raise taxes on the middle and lower classes. So according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, as early as next year, those making under $10,000 will see a 0.3% increase in their taxes, which is a far cry from those making over $400,000. And those making anywhere from $30,000 to $100,000 will see a steady 1 to 2% increase in taxes over the next 5 to 7 years. And the Democrats are really banking on increased revenue from the middle and lower classes to decrease the federal deficit. That's how they're actually closing the deficit. We'll see Biden and Democrats talk about making the rich pay their fair share, but it's anything but that. According to the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance, the, quote, Inflation Reduction Act will raise $16.7 billion from those making less than $200,000. So, of course, how are you going to raise more money from people that you're not raising taxes on? The Heritage Foundation continues to just point out the flaws in, Biden's promise and Democrat logic by adding that those making less than $200,000 will pay for most of the taxes between 2023 and 2031. Those making less than $75,000 will pay $135.9 billion in taxes, according to this bill, and those making $75,000 to $200,000 will pay $151.8 billion. Now let's compare those to the super rich, or not even the super rich. Those making anywhere from $200,000 to $1 million cumulatively will pay only $123.7 billion, which, if you were keeping track, is less than those making $75,000, the 0 to $75,000 group. And even those making over $1 million will only pay $101.6 billion, which is even less. So Biden claims this bill will make the economy more fair and build America from, quote, the ground up and the middle out, unquote. But his tax agenda clearly says otherwise. And the worst part about this is that Republicans even gave him an easy out. Senator Mike Crapo from Idaho wanted to include a provision that those with taxable incomes of less than $400,000 would be excluded from IRS audits and a tax. But every Senate Democrat voted against the amendment. Wow. Simply astonishing. And in addition to higher taxes on the middle to lower class, Biden is also hiring up to 87,000 IRS agents to force compliance with the new tax law. So I'm going to repeat that, 87,000 new IRS agents. The bill relies heavily on increased tax compliance to raise enough revenue to cover the roughly $750 billion price tag that's associated with this bill. Now, those on the left will swarm to debunk this claim. Snopes, for an example, gave this claim a false rating, despite the fact that they later proved in the article that this is true. And I actually see this a lot with Snopes. So Snopes gives it a false rating, says they're not hiring 87,000 agents at once. Haha, they're breaking it apart over a few years. They're not hiring 87,000 new enforcement agents, but rather those agents will be all spread out through the Internal Revenue Service. Once again, they say, quote, Treasury officials say they do not know the exact number of enforcement agents that will be added to the staff. But just play along with me here. Over half of the money allocated to the IRS in this bill is for increased enforcement of tax law to collect, quote, underreported income. So 45.6 billion out of the 80 total billion given to the IRS is to be used for enforcement. So let's assume over half the new hires will be enforcement agents, since over half of the money is being allocated specifically for enforcement. We're still looking at approximately 45,000 new IRS agents. But then they say, quote, a Treasury Department May 2021 report estimated that the injection of the new funds via the legislation, so this, in quote, Inflation Reduction Act, would enable the IRS to incrementally hire around 86,852 new staff by 2031. So yes, the IRS is hiring 87,000 new employees over 9 years, which a lot of them will probably be enforcement agents. Snopes continues, quote, the Treasury Department report analyzed how best for the administration to address the, quote, tax gap, unquote, which is the difference between what is owed to the government and what is actually collected. That figure is believed to be at least $381 billion a year due to underreporting of income. According to the report, enforcement will be focused on those with higher incomes, unquote. So it's nice that Snopes says this, and that the Treasury Department says that we're going to focus our enforcement on those with the most underreported income and in higher incomes. But you want to know what group has the most, quote, underreported income according to the IRS? If you said middle and lower class Americans, you're right. Those making from anywhere from $0 to $100,000 make up 78% of, quote, misreported trade or business activity income according to the IRS. And that same group makes up 65% of misreported, quote, other income producing activities according to the IRS. Not only that, 90% of all revenue raised from this increased enforcement of, quote, misreported income will come from those making less than $200,000. So once again, Snopes is entirely wrong, because the only way they can get this money is by going after those who underreport, and the vast majority of those who underreport tend to be the middle and lower class. So middle and lower class business owners are definitely going to be feeling new pinches with this new IRS. But Snopes isn't done. They say U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen sent a letter to the IRS directing the agency to limit those audits to higher earners. Don't worry, everyone. Janet Yellen wrote a letter. The IRS won't audit middle-class Americans despite them having to bear the most of the brunt of this tax hike. And knowing the IRS's history of always being impartial and nonpartisan, I have total faith that they will keep their word. But in all seriousness, considering how Democrats use big government bureaucracies to target political enemies, we saw that with parents concerned over the curriculum, the FBI treated them as domestic terrorists. Biden's DOJ has gone after journalists investigating his son's relationship with Ukraine, and of course, raiding a former president's personal home, or even rogue FBI agents taking it upon themselves to discredit a sitting president. We should be very concerned with the growth of any government agency under this regime. So, we're stuck with a bill that won't reduce inflation, won't reduce the deficit, and we will have new IRS hires that will have to audit more and more middle and lower class Americans if this bill is to be successful at all. Either way, the Democrats are way, way off of their promises. So what will this bill actually do? We know it won't reduce inflation. We know it's going to increase our taxes and increase IRS enforcement of these new taxes. But what does the bill actually do? You obviously can't pass a bill like that. Well, like I said, it's essentially Build Back Better 2.0, and it passes a whole bunch of Democrat policy priorities. They extend and create new clean energy tax credits, they allow Medicare to negotiate prescription drug costs, and they continue to support the failed Obamacare by artificially suppressing premiums. So once again, nothing here to actually decrease inflation. So we know this bill passes a lot of Democrat priorities. So what's been their response to it? Their response has been interesting, and it's been twofold. First, they either fawn over the bill and Joe Biden, or completely ignore the fact that this bill will have nothing to do with inflation. But first, I want to look at their fawning, and CNN Politics ran an article where they just drooled over Joe Biden. And the article is titled, quote, "The same Joe Biden suddenly looks different," unquote. They start the article by saying, quote, "Joe Biden is no more or less capable of president than he was 2 months ago. His staff no more or less competent. But suddenly images of Biden as a feeble septuagenarian atop a mismanaged White House have given way to those of an experienced leader, smiling behind aviator sunglasses, whose battle-tested team has delivered on a range of national priorities. A winning streak does that for you," unquote. Oh my goodness. Oh, the drooling. They're just drooling all over Joe Biden right here. But at the same time, all of these compliments are horribly backhanded. They say that Joe Biden is no different than he was 2 months ago. Nothing's changed. And even though he was a doddering fool, now due to this, quote, winning streak, I guess if you could call passing one bill a winning streak, now he's some national hero akin to LBJ or JFK. Or FDR, sorry, not JFK. And I love this next section, quote, "Progressive lawmakers who scorned the former senator's talk of working with the GOP have seen Congress make bipartisan investments in infrastructure, domestic manufacturing of semiconductors, and veterans health care. They joined a critical mass of Republicans to pass them." Okay, so I see 1, 2, 3 bills that he's passed. Great lawmaker right here. Really great at just making everyone come together and pass his agenda. Others who have complained Biden had veered too far left have seen Congress take the largest ever government steps to curb climate change. Not a single Republican voted yes, every single Democrat did. Oh, great. In the first paragraph, they're congratulating Biden for his nonpartisan work. And then in the next paragraph, they're celebrating him passing his climate agenda along bipartisan lines. It's like they can't make up their mind. But speaking about this, quote, climate package, the article, whose whole purpose was to prop up Joe Biden in response to his, quote, Inflation Reduction Act, only ever refers to the legislation by that name once. And it's when they say they only named it that way to get Joe Manchin on board. Instead, they refer to it as the, quote, climate package, which, like I said at the beginning of the show, seems to really illustrate the point that this bill might not have anything to do with inflation reduction, but in fact is a Trojan horse for a whole bunch of other Democrat priorities. And this exact same attitude is reflected in another CNN article which headlines, quote, "Senate passes Democrats' sweeping healthcare and climate bill," unquote. Healthcare and climate? Why didn't CNN celebrate the fact that it was reducing inflation? Oh, wait, it's because this bill has nothing to do with inflation, besides the fact that it's named, quote, the Inflation Reduction Act. And of course, it's not just CNN that does this. NPR says, quote, "The massive climate, healthcare, and tax bill," once again, nothing about inflation, "making its way towards the president's desk is called the Inflation Reduction Act." So, of course, once again, none of the points that NPR brings up is about the bill actually reducing inflation, because, of course, we know it won't do that. Even a quick search of the White House's press release for the Inflation Reduction Act, it never once mentions inflation or how the bill will actually fight it, besides one statement in the last paragraph that says, quote, "Reducing the deficit will help fight inflation and support a strong, stable economic growth." I've already covered how, according to UPenn, the expenditures of this bill already negate any deficit reduction, and how the deficit reduction would only reduce the inflation rate by 0.018%. And it's not just me, some crazy right-wing nut who recognizes that the Inflation Adjustment Act has nothing to do with inflation. Even coming out of their own words, leftist politicians are shying away from it. On Twitter, prominent left-wing politicians are celebrating this, quote, victory, but then not describing how it will impact inflation. Senate Leader Chuck Schumer had this to say about the bill. He said, quote, "Make sure your family and friends see this. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 will be the largest package to fight the climate crisis ever passed by Congress," unquote. So this bill will fight inflation or the climate crisis? Schumer only acknowledges that it will fight the climate crisis, not do anything to reduce inflation. Even President Biden won't say that the bill actually reduces inflation. In a series of tweets, he said, quote, "The Inflation Reduction Act will help save money on prescription drugs, cut healthcare premiums, cut energy costs, take aggressive actions on climate, and make large corporations pay their fair share in taxes." He says again, quote, "Thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, America is going to take the most aggressive action we've ever seen taken in confronting the climate crisis and strengthening the energy security of America and the world." Finally, he says, quote, "With the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the American people are going to see lower prescription drug prices, lower healthcare costs, and lower energy costs, and big corporations are finally going to start paying their fair share." Did you ever hear the word inflation in any of these tweets? No, of course not, besides the name of the bill. The Inflation Reduction Act will take aggressive action against not the inflationary crisis, but rather the climate crisis. Once again, showing Democrats clear priorities. It's not about helping Americans, but rather pandering to their radical base. So why does this matter? Once again, it goes to show how important it is to get out and vote. If we had just one more senator, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We need to be sure that we go out and vote all these Democrats that voted for a tax hike on Americans amidst a recession and record high inflation. We vote them out of office. We can't rely on Democrats like Manchin and Sinema to protect our country. When it matters most, they end up siding with the Democrats and have consistently through Biden's administration. So we need to replace them with strong conservatives in our government that will actually protect us. We have very close Senate races coming up in Arizona, Georgia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. It's essential that we win them all. Next, it matters because as conservatives, we need to be concerned about the growth in and size and scope of the federal government. Any bill that seeks to add almost 100,000 new government agents to any sort of enforcement role should be very concerning. We need to be advocating for a limited government, one we wouldn't mind having even if those who we disagreed with politically were in charge. Finally, we need to be honest about the Inflation Reduction Act. It doesn't reduce inflation, plain and simple. But then again, it was never meant to reduce inflation, but rather be a Trojan horse meant to pass all the Democrat priorities. Thank you guys for tuning into the Big Red for America show. This is Big Red. See you all next time. Like what you heard? Tune in next week as we tackle another topic. If you want to see more from the Big Red from America team, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Getter, and Parler. Once again, this is Big Red signing off for the Big Red for America show, where the opinions are always right and the facts are always cited.